Ever wonder what truly defines a man? Wealth, power, or the secrets he's buried for decades? Picture this: a titan of the elite world, standing at the peak of success, only to find his empire trembling because of a faded letter and a truth he's too afraid to face. This journey will take you through glittering halls and hidden corners of the heart, where honor isn't something you own, it's something you fight to reclaim. If you're ready to dive into this emotional ride, hit that like button and subscribe. Now don't miss a single moment. James Carver stood at the edge of the stage, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing against his tailored black suit. The grand ballroom of the Houston Galleria Hotel glittered under a chandelier the size of a small car, its crystal prisms scattering light across the polished marble floor. At 65, he was no stranger to these gatherings, energy summits, where billionaires and CEOs traded handshakes like currency, but tonight felt different. The air hummed with anticipation, not just for the keynote address he was about to deliver, but for something sharper, something personal. He adjusted his cufflinks, silver and understated, a habit born from decades of discipline. Carver energy. The empire he'd built from a single oil rig into a titan of renewable tech was his legacy. It defined him. Or so he'd told himself for 40 years, ever since he'd walked away from Margaret Ellis, Maggie, with her soft voice and fierce eyes, because love, he'd reasoned, was a luxury he couldn't afford. Weakness was the enemy of success, and James Carver didn't lose. The MC's voice boomed through the speakers, pulling him back. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the chairman of Carver Energy, James Carver. Applause erupted, crisp and obligatory, as he stepped into the spotlight. The heat of it prickled his skin, but his face remained a mask, cool, composed, untouchable. He scanned the crowd, suits and silk dresses, faces he'd outmaneuvered or outlasted. Then he saw Victor Grayson. Victor lounged at a front-row table, a glass of bourbon dangling from his fingers, his smirk as sharp as a blade. 58, lean and silver-haired, he looked every bit the predator he'd become. Once James's closest friend Victor had turned rival after a merger went sour 20 years ago, his envy festering into something venomous. Tonight, that venom was on display. James gripped the podium, his knuckles whitening briefly before he forced them to relax. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady, resonant. "Tonight, we're here to talk about the future of energy. Clean, sustainable, unbreakable. At Carver Energy, we don't just build systems. We build trust." The words flowed effortlessly, rehearsed to perfection. He spoke of innovation, of resilience, of a world powered by vision. The audience nodded, some scribbling notes, others sipping champagne. But Victor's eyes never left him, glinting with a challenge James couldn't ignore. As the applause faded, Victor rose, slow and deliberate, clapping louder than the rest. The room quieted, sensing a shift. "Well said, James," he drawled, his Texas accent thick with mockery. "Trust, huh? That's rich coming from you. A man who's got billions but no one to share 'em with. Tell me, how's that trust working out for the family you left behind?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, whispers igniting like sparks. James's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He'd faced worse: boardroom coups, market crashes, sleepless nights over balance sheets. Victor was fishing, baiting him with a past James had buried deep. Maggie's face flashed in his mind, her standing on that Dallas porch, tears streaking her cheeks, her voice breaking as she begged him not to go. He'd chosen a plane ticket to New York over her, a contract over a life. That was 40 years ago. He'd won, hadn't he? "Victor," James said, his tone even, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I don't need you to define honor for me. My work speaks for itself." He forced a smile, thin and controlled, the kind that had disarmed enemies for decades. The audience chuckled nervously, some nodding in approval, but Victor's grin widened. "Work?" Victor shot back, stepping closer to the stage. "You mean that shiny empire you built on sand? Rich, sure, but respected? Not by anyone who knows the truth. You're a hollow shell, Carver, all polish, no soul. The words landed like a punch, but James didn't swing back. He could have called out Victor's own failures, the shady deals, the lawsuits he'd dodged. Instead, he stood still, hands resting lightly on the podium, his pulse steady despite the heat rising in his chest. Control was his weapon, always had been. He wouldn't give Victor the satisfaction of a crack in the armor. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said, turning to the crowd, his voice calm but commanding. "Let's keep this about the future, not petty games. We're here to build something lasting. That's what matters." The room erupted in applause. Again, louder this time, drowning Victor's next barb. He sat down, smirking still. But James felt the shift, attention returning to him, the victor by default. Yet as he stepped off the stage, the triumph tasted hollow. Victor's words clung to him, a burr under his skin. "The family you left behind." Did he mean Maggie? Or something more? Back in the shadows of the wings, James loosened his tie, the silk slipping through his fingers. He was alone now, the buzz of the ballroom fading behind thick curtains. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. The memory came unbidden. His mother's kitchen, the smell of burnt toast, her frail hands pouring him coffee the morning he left for good. "You'll regret this, Jimmy," she'd whispered. "Money don't hug you back." He'd laughed then, kissed her forehead, and walked out. She'd died alone a decade later, and he hadn't gone to the funeral, too busy closing a deal in Shanghai. He opened his eyes, the glare of a spotlight slicing through the dark. Victor's taunt wasn't just noise. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth James had spent 40 years outrunning. He straightened, smoothing his jacket, and headed for the exit. The night wasn't over, but something had begun. A crack in the glass he'd polished so carefully. Honor, he'd told himself, was in the empire he'd built. But as he stepped into the humid Houston air, the weight of that lie pressed harder than the applause ever could. James Carver's office perched on the 47th floor of Carver Energy's Houston headquarters, a glass and steel monument to his ambition. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering grid of lights against the night sky, but he barely noticed. He sat at his desk, dark mahogany polished to a mirror shine, still in his suit from the conference, the tie now a crumpled heap beside, a half-empty tumbler of bourbon. Victor Grayson's words echoed in his skull like a drumbeat. Not respected by anyone who knows the truth. He'd brushed it off on stage, but here, alone, the barb sank deeper. He leaned back in his leather chair, the creak of it loud in the silence. The office was his sanctuary, a fortress of order, shelves lined with industry awards, a framed Forbes cover from '98, a single photo of him shaking hands with a senator. No family pictures, no traces of softness. That was deliberate. Softness lost deals. Softness lost wars. He'd learned that early, watching his father drink away their grocery money, leaving his mother to scrape by on a seamstress's wage. James had vowed never to be weak. His gaze drifted to the desk's bottom drawer, one he rarely opened. It held relics, old contracts, a broken watch, things he couldn't throw out but didn't want to see. Tonight, though, his hand moved almost on its own, sliding it open. Dust puffed up, faint and stale. He rummaged through the clutter, a yellowed memo, a faded business card. Then his fingers brushed something softer, a single envelope, creased and worn, sealed shut. He pulled it out, his breath catching. The handwriting was hers, Maggie's, looping and careful, the kind she'd used to scribble grocery lists on the back of receipts. His chest tightened as he turned it over. No address, no stamp, just his name. James. He hadn't seen her script in 40 years. Not since he'd left her crying on that Dallas porch, her voice breaking as she begged him to stay. He'd promised he'd come back once he'd made it. Big. A lie, even then. The bourbon burned his throat as he took a swig, steadying himself. He slit the envelope with a letter opener, the paper tearing with a dry rasp. Inside was a single sheet, folded once, the ink faded but legible. He unfolded it, and her words hit him like a quiet storm. James, I waited for you. Months turned into years, and I still waited. You chose money over us, and I can't hate you for it. I tried. I'm writing this because I need you to know. I kept our child, a boy. He's 5 now, asks about you sometimes. I tell him you're busy, that you're a good man who had to go away. It's a lie I live with because the truth would break him. You don't have to come back. We're fine. But if you ever wonder what you left behind, it's him. And me. Maggie. The letter slipped from his hands, fluttering to the desk. A boy. His son. The room spun, the bourbon souring in his gut. He pressed his palms to his eyes, willing the words away, but they burned into him. 5 years old when she wrote this, 40 years ago. That made him 35 now, older, alive, dead. The questions clawed at him, each one a shard of glass in his carefully constructed world. He stood pacing to the window, the city lights blurring through a sudden sting in his eyes. Maggie had been pregnant when he left. He hadn't known. Or had he? There'd been a moment, a flicker in her eyes that last day, a hand resting on her stomach. He'd ignored it, told himself it was nothing, boarded the plane to New York anyway. A contract with an oil baron waited, his first big break. He'd won it, built Carver Energy from that single deal. And lost her. Lost them. His. Reflection stared back from the glass, lined face, gray hair, a man who'd conquered everything but himself. Honor, he'd always thought, was in the empire he'd forged. He'd told himself Maggie would understand, that she'd see the necessity of his choice. But the letter said otherwise. She'd raised a child alone, fed him lies to shield him from the truth. His father was a coward who'd run. James returned to the desk, picking up the letter again. His hands trembled, but he didn't crumple it, didn't toss it aside. That would have been easy, and he wasn't a man for easy outs. Not anymore. He read it once more, slower, letting each word settle. A good man who had to go away. She'd protected him, even in her pain. That was Maggie. Fierce, steady, the kind of strength he'd never had. The memory came unbidden. Her tiny apartment in Dallas, the sagging couch where they'd planned a life, her laughter as she burned pancakes. On a Sunday morning. He'd loved her, hadn't he? But love was a risk, and risks were for fools. So he'd walked away, built walls of steel and glass to keep the world at bay. Now those walls felt like a cage. He sank back into the chair, the letter still in hand. Victor's taunt replayed. No one respects a man who abandons his own. Did he know? Had he dug up this ghost to wield against him? Or was it just a lucky shot in the dark? Either way, it didn't matter. The truth was out now, at least to James. He had a son, or had had one, and Maggie, somewhere, carried the weight he'd refused to bear. The bourbon sat untouched as he stared at the envelope, its edges yellowed with time. He could burn it, pretend he'd never seen it, go back to the life he'd mastered. But something held him, a flicker of dignity, a whisper of the man he might have been. He folded the letter carefully, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and stood. The office was silent, the city beyond indifferent. But inside him, a crack had widened, and through it came a question he couldn't shake. What did I leave behind? Drive to St. Luke's Community Hospital took James Carver through Houston's ragged edges, past strip malls and cracked sidewalks, far from the gleaming towers of downtown. The letter from Maggie burned in his jacket pocket, a silent passenger he couldn't ignore. He'd spent 2 sleepless nights since finding it, wrestling with the truth it held. A son, a life he'd abandoned. At 65, he'd faced down oil tycoons and market crashes. But this was uncharted. His hands gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black Mercedes, knuckles white, as he pulled into the hospital lot. St. Luke's was a squat, weathered building, its beige brick stained by years of Texas sun. Not the kind of place he'd ever set foot in. His world was private clinics and VIP suites. He stepped out, the humid air clinging to his suit, and adjusted his tie. Discipline kept him moving forward, even as his pulse thrummed with something dangerously close to fear. He wasn't here to beg or grovel. He just needed to see her, to know what 40 years had made of Margaret Ellis. The lobby smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, a low buzz of voices filling the space. Nurses in faded scrubs shuffled past, patients slumped in plastic chairs. James scanned the room, then froze. There she was, behind the reception desk, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her hands sorting charts with a quiet efficiency he'd never forgotten. Maggie. Older, yes, lines etched around her eyes and mouth, but still her, still that steady grace he'd once loved and left. He approached, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum. She looked up, and for a moment, time collapsed. Her hazel eyes widened, then narrowed, recognition flashing like a storm cloud. "James," she said, her voice low, edged with steel. "What are you doing here?" He stopped a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back, a posture of control he'd mastered in boardrooms. "Maggie," he replied, keeping his tone even. "I found your letter, the one you never sent." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she set the charts down with deliberate care. 40 years late, huh? Should have known you'd show. Up when it suited you. The words cut, but her calm delivery stung more. No anger, just a weary truth. "I didn't know," he said, the words tasting hollow even to him. "About the boy. Our son." She studied him, her gaze piercing through the layers he'd built. Money, power, pride. "His name's Thomas," she said finally. "And he's not a boy anymore. He's a man. A doctor. Right here in this hospital. Raised him myself. No thanks to you." The air left James's lungs, a quiet punch. Thomas. A doctor. Alive. Real. Not just a ghost on paper. He glanced around, half expecting to see a younger version of himself stride through the doors. But the lobby stayed mundane. Patients coughing, a janitor mopping in the corner. "I want to meet him," he said, voice steady despite the tremor, in his chest. Maggie's laugh was short, bitter. "You don't get to waltz in here and play father, James. Thomas doesn't know you. Doesn't need you. I made sure of that." She stepped out from behind the desk, closing the distance between them. She was shorter than he remembered, but her presence loomed. "You chose your empire over us. Live with it." Her words landed, like a verdict, and for a moment, he felt the old urge to argue, to defend the life he'd built, the sacrifices that had made him a titan. But he didn't. He stood there, hands still clasped, letting her judgment settle. "I'm not here to take anything," he said. I need to see he's okay." Maggie's eyes softened, just a flicker, before hardening again. "He's more than okay. He's good. Better than you ever were. Saves lives every day. No private jets or fancy suits required." She paused, then pointed down the hall. "He's in surgery now. You can wait if you want, but don't expect a reunion. He's got no reason to want you." James nodded, a single sharp motion, and turned toward the waiting area. The plastic chairs creaked under his weight as he sat. The letter, a heavy lump against his ribs. He watched Maggie return to her work, her hands moving with the same care he'd seen her use to mend his shirts in that tiny Dallas apartment. She'd been his anchor once, and he'd cut the line, convinced it was strength. Now he saw it for what it was. Cowardice. A memory surfaced, unbidden. His mother's voice, soft and tired, over a cup of weak tea in her kitchen. "You're chasing shadows, Jimmy. Real strength is staying, not running." He'd dismissed her, left her to die alone while he signed deals in far-off cities. And Maggie, he'd done the same to her, to Thomas. The pattern stared him in. The face. A mirror he couldn't shatter. Footsteps echoed down the hall and a man emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered in green scrubs, his dark hair streaked with gray. James's breath caught. Thomas. The resemblance was faint but undeniable. The square jaw, the steady gait. He moved with purpose, stopping to speak to a nurse, his voice low and calm. James stood, drawn forward, but Maggie's warning held him back. He watched from a distance as Thomas disappeared into another room, oblivious to the father he'd never known. James sank back into the chair, the antiseptic air thick in his throat. Thomas was real, living, breathing, a man who'd grown without him. Maggie had done that, built a life from the wreckage he'd left. His empire, his billions, felt small against that truth. Victor's taunt rang again. A hollow shell. Maybe he was right. He didn't move as the minutes ticked by, the hospital's hum a steady backdrop. He could leave, retreat to his glass tower, bury this like he'd buried everything else. But he stayed, hands folded in his lap, the letter, a silent vow. Not to force his way in, not yet, but to face what he'd done. Dignity, he realized, wasn't in the silence he'd kept on that stage. It was here, in this cracked waiting room, waiting for a chance he might not deserve. James Carver sat in his office, the Houston skyline a muted glow beyond the tinted glass. The letter from Maggie rested on his desk, its creased edges a stark contrast to the sleek lines of his world. 3 days had passed since he'd seen her at St. Luke's, since he'd glimpsed Thomas moving through the hospital with a purpose James had never given him. He hadn't gone back, not yet. The weight of 40 years wasn't something you stormed through. It demanded patience, a virtue he'd rarely practiced. His phone buzzed, shattering the silence. A news alert. Carver Energy chairman, linked to secret family scandal. His stomach dropped. He clicked the link, and there it was. Victor Grayson's handiwork splashed across the Houston Chronicle's front page. Sources close to Carver Energy allege James Carver abandoned a pregnant lover decades ago, leaving a child to fend for himself. Is the titan of clean energy a fraud? The article was thin on facts, heavy on innuendo, but the photo, a grainy shot of James leaving St. Luke's, made it real. He leaned back, the leather chair groaning under his weight. Victor hadn't wasted time. That barb at the conference wasn't a fluke. It was a fuse, and this was the explosion. James's fingers hovered over his phone, itching to call his PR team to unleash a counterstrike, dig up Victor's own dirt, his tax evasions, his mistress in Dallas. But he stopped. That was the old playbook, the one that had kept him untouchable. This time it felt wrong. The intercom crackled. "Mr. Carver, the board's on line 1, his assistant's voice chirped, tight with nerves. He pressed the button. "Put them through." "James," came the gravelly tone of Ed Thornton, the board's bulldog. "What the hell's this? Mess? Stock's down 3 points already. Reporters are camped outside. You've got a bastard kid?" "No proof," James said, voice steady as steel. "It's gossip. Victor's stirring the pot. Gossip or not, it's bleeding us." Ed snapped. "Cutter's threatening to pull his merger if you don't clean this up." "Step down, let it blow over." James's jaw tightened. Step down. 40 years building Carver Energy, and they'd toss him for a rumor. "I'm not running," he said. "We ride it out. Focus on the solar deal." Results shut mouths. Pause, then Ed grunted. "Your funeral. Fix it fast." The line went dead. He stood, pacing to the window. Below, news vans clustered like vultures, their lights flashing against the dusk. The empire he'd forged, clean energy, a legacy of progress, was teetering, not because of numbers, but because of him, his past, his choices. Maggie's letter loomed in his mind. "You chose money over us." Had he? He grabbed his keys. He needed air, perspective, something beyond these walls. 20 minutes later, he parked outside St. Luke's again, the hospital's dim glow a beacon in the twilight. He didn't go in right away. Instead, he watched from the lot, the Mercedes a quiet shield. Through the glass doors, he saw Maggie, at her station, her hands deft as she bandaged an elderly man's arm. Nearby, Thomas emerged from a hallway, scrubs rumpled, speaking to a nurse with that same calm intensity. James's chest ached, a son he'd never known, a life he'd never shaped. The moment broke as a reporter's van screeched into the lot, cameras swinging toward him. He ducked low, cursing under his breath. They'd followed him, Flashbulbs popped, voices shouting, "Mr. Carver, is it true? Did you abandon your family?" He could have driven off, let the tinted windows swallow him whole. But he didn't. He stepped out, the humid air thick against his skin, and faced them. The pack surged, mics thrusting forward. "No comment," he said, voice low but firm, hands in his pockets, a wall of restraint. They pressed harder. "Who's the kid? What's the mother's name?" He didn't flinch, didn't snap, though the urge burned hot. This wasn't about winning a shouting match. It was about protecting Maggie, Thomas, the fragile thread he'd only just found. A security guard pushed through, barking at the reporters to back off. James slipped inside, the hospital's hum swallowing the chaos. Maggie looked up from her desk, eyes narrowing. "You brought them here," she said, not a question. "Not on purpose," he replied, meeting her gaze. "They're after blood. Victor's feeding them." She crossed her arms, her scrubs creased from a long shift. "And you're surprised? You live in that world, James. We don't." He nodded, accepting the rebuke. "I didn't come to drag you into it. He faltered, searching for words. "I saw Thomas again. From outside. He's good, isn't he?" Her face softened, just a flicker. "The best. Saves people every day. People you'd never notice." She paused, then added, "He doesn't need this circus. Neither do I." "I know," he said, voice quieter now. "I'll keep it away." She studied him, skeptical but silent, then turned back to her work. James lingered, watching her hands move. Steady, sure, the hands that had raised his son. A memory flickered. His mother, stitching a torn shirt late at night, whispering, "Real men don't run from their messes." He hadn't listened then. Now he couldn't look away. His phone buzzed. Victor. He answered, stepping into the hall. "Enjoying your little show?" James asked, tone flat. Victor's laugh crackled through. "Just getting started, old friend. Keep hiding and they'll tear you apart. Admit you're a fraud or I will." James gripped the phone, his pulse steady despite the fire in his veins. "You want to fight, Victor? You'll get it, but not your way." He hung up, the click a small victory. No shouting, no threats, just resolve. He wouldn't stoop to Victor's game, wouldn't let rage dictate him. Not this time. Back in the waiting room he sat, the plastic chair hard against his spine. The reporters lingered outside, but he stayed, eyes on Maggie, then Thomas as he passed again. Oblivious, focused, a man James hadn't earned. The scandal could take, his company, his name. But this family he'd lost, he wouldn't let it touch them. Dignity wasn't in the empire anymore. It was here, in the choice to stand still, to shield them, even if they never knew. James Carver stood in the sterile glow of St. Luke's waiting room, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The reporters had thinned outside, their vans retreating under the cover of night, but the weight of their questions lingered. Maggie's words echoed too. He doesn't need this circus. He'd stayed anyway, rooted to the cracked plastic chair, watching her move through her shift with a grace that shamed his polished empire. Thomas had passed twice more, tall, steady, a stranger with James's jawline, each glimpse a quiet knife in his chest. His phone vibrated against his thigh. Another alert. Carver energy stock plummets amid scandal. He silenced it, eyes fixed on the hall where Thomas had disappeared. The board could wait. Victor could wait. This man he'd never known, was all that mattered now. Maggie emerged. From behind her desk, her scrubs wrinkled from hours on her feet. She stopped, arms crossed, staring at him. "You're still here," she said, her voice flat but edged with something softer. Resignation, maybe. "I am," James replied, standing slowly, hands loose at his sides. No posturing now, just a man stripped bare. "I meant what I said, Maggie. I'll keep this away from him. From you." She snorted, a faint, tired sound. "Good luck with that. Your world doesn't care about promises." She hesitated, then sighed. But since you're here, you might as well know the rest. His pulse quickened. The rest? She nodded, gesturing him to follow. They walked down a narrow corridor past beeping monitors and hushed voices until she stopped at a glass window overlooking an operating room. Inside, Thomas stood under bright surgical lights, his gloved hands steady as he worked on a patient, a child small and still on the table. James pressed a hand to the glass, breath catching. His son, saving lives. He's been here 10 years, Maggie said, her voice low, almost reverent. Best surgeon we've got. Never asks for anything, works doubles, takes the hard cases. But he's not invincible. James turned to her, brow furrowing. What do you mean? She met his gaze, unflinching. He's sick, James. Heart condition. Congenital. Been fighting it since he was a kid. Doctors say he needs surgery soon, or... Her voice cracked just for a second, before she steadied it. He got it from you. Runs in your family, doesn't it? The words hit like a freight train. James staggered back, his mind racing to his father, dead at 50 from a heart attack, a ticking bomb no one had warned him about. He'd dodged it, or so he'd thought. Checkups, clean bills of health. But Thomas, he inherited it, he whispered, the realization a stone in his gut. From me. Maggie nodded, her eyes hard but glistening. I didn't tell you to guilt you, I told you because he doesn't know who you are. And he doesn't want your help, not your money, not your name. He's too proud for that. James stared through the glass, watching Thomas's hands move with precision, a life hanging in the balance. Pride. That too was his, a stubborn streak he'd passed down without ever knowing. I could have been there, he said, voice rough. I should have been. Should have doesn't change anything, Maggie snapped. But there's more you need to hear. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, worn and creased, and thrust it at him. Read it. He took it, hands trembling as he unfolded it. A job application, dated 10 years back, addressed to Carver Energy. Thomas Ellis, MD. Objective: to contribute to sustainable energy solutions through medical innovation. A cover letter followed. I don't need a handout. I want to earn my place, prove I'm more than my past. I don't need my father's shadow. I need a chance. James's breath stopped. Thomas had applied to his company. His son had stood at his door. And he'd never known. Victor saw it, Maggie said, her voice cutting through the haze. He was your advisor then. Told me he shredded it. Said Thomas didn't fit the corporate image. Said you'd never want a reminder of me hanging around. James's vision blurred, rage flaring hot and fast. Victor, the man who'd taunted him, who'd orchestrated this scandal, had known, had kept Thomas from him out of spite. His fists clenched, the paper crumpling, but he forced them open, forced the anger down. Not here, not now. He wouldn't let it rule him. Not in front of Maggie, not with Thomas's life on the line. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, voice raw. Back then, she laughed, a hollow sound. Tell you? You were a ghost, James. I called once. Your secretary said you were in Tokyo, too busy to talk. I wasn't going to beg. He winced. The memory sharp, endless trips, endless excuses. I didn't know, he said again, weaker this time. You didn't want to, she shot back. But now you do. And Thomas, he's in there, fighting for that kid while his own heart's failing. So what are you going to do about it? James looked back at the operating room, Thomas's silhouette a beacon under the lights. His son, a man of honor forged without him, now fragile in a way James had caused. The weight of it crushed him. Decades of denial, of running, collapsing into this moment. He could pay for the surgery, force his way in, but Maggie's words held him back. He doesn't want your help. I don't know, he admitted, voice breaking. But I'm not leaving him again. Not like this. Maggie's eyes softened, just a fraction, before she turned away. Then figure it out, she said, walking back to her station. But don't expect him to make it easy. James stayed, the glass cold against his palm, watching Thomas work. Victor's betrayal burned, the media's claws loomed, but none of it mattered now. His son was dying, because of him, because of a legacy he'd never claimed. Dignity wasn't in fighting back with fists or headlines. It was in this, standing here, facing the truth, choosing to stay when every instinct screamed to run. The surgical lights flickered, and James whispered to the glass, "I'll fix this, Thomas." Somehow. James Carver stood outside St. Luke's emergency wing, the night air thick with humidity and the distant wail of sirens. Hours had passed since Maggie's revelation, Thomas's heart condition, the job application Victor had buried. He'd stayed until dawn broke, watching through the glass as Thomas emerged from surgery, his son's face pale but resolute. James hadn't approached him. Not yet. Dignity, he'd learned, wasn't in forcing his way in. It was in waiting, in earning what he'd lost. His phone buzzed incessantly. Board members, PR, headlines screaming, "Carver's secret son, fraud." Or father? He ignored them, driving back to Carver Energy's headquarters as the city woke. The glass tower loomed against a gray sky, a monument to his past. Inside, the boardroom waited, and with it, a reckoning he couldn't avoid. The room was a battlefield when he entered. 10 suits around a mahogany table, faces grim under recessed lights. Ed Thornton, the board's grizzled enforcer, stood at the head, arms crossed. Victor Grayson sat to the side, invited as a consultant, his smirk a knife's edge. The air crackled with tension, the hum of the city muted beyond soundproof. "Walls, James," Ed began, voice rough as gravel. "Stocks tanked 8%. Cutter's out, merger's dead. This bastard kid story's killing us. Step down, or we vote you out." James set his briefcase down, movements deliberate, and took his seat. The letter from Maggie rested in his pocket, a quiet anchor. He met Ed's glare, then Victor's, his pulse steady despite the storm inside. "No proof," he said, voice calm, cutting through the room's edge. "Just rumors. Victor's rumors." Victor leaned forward, bourbon on his breath even at 9 a.m. "Rumors with teeth, old friend. You've got a kid out there. Doctor or not, he's a stain. Admit it, or I'll make sure every paper from here to New York prints the birth certificate." Threat landed sharp and cold, but James didn't flinch. He could have lashed out, exposed Victor's sabotage, the shredded application, the decades of petty vengeance. Instead, he folded his hands on the table, a wall of restraint. "You've got nothing," he said. "And I'm not running." Ed slammed a fist down. "This isn't a game, Carver. We're bleeding money. Step aside. Let Grayson take the chair. Clean slate." James's eyes flicked to Victor, who grinned like a shark tasting blood. The board murmured, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. 40 years, every deal, every sleepless night teetered on this moment. He could fight, claw his way back with lawyers and spin. But then what? More walls, more isolation. He thought of Thomas, fighting for a child's life under those surgical lights, and Maggie, holding their world together while he'd chased shadows. He stood, the chair scraping softly, and faced them. "You want a clean slate?" he said, voice rising but steady, a quiet thunder. "Here's the truth. I left a woman I loved 40 years ago. She had my son. I didn't know, not until now. I built this company on discipline, on sacrifice, but I sacrificed the wrong things. That's on me, not them." The room stilled, breaths held. Victor's smirk faltered just for a second. James kept going, eyes sweeping the table. "You can vote me out, take my chair, but I'm done hiding. My son's out there, dying from a heart I gave him, and I won't let your games or yours, Victor, touch him. Carver Energy's bigger than me. It'll survive. I'll make sure of it." Ed blinked, caught off guard. "You're admitting it? On record?" "Yes," James said, unflinching, "because it's the truth. And I'm not ashamed of him. I'm ashamed it took me this long to see it." Victor laughed, a harsh bark. "Noble now, are we?" "Too late, Carver. You're a fraud, a hollow shell. Always were." The words stung, old wounds flaring, but James didn't rise to it. He looked at Victor, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. You've spent years trying to break me, Victor. I let you once, when I walked away from them. Not anymore. He turned to the board. Vote if you want. I'll step down if that's what it takes. But I'm not leaving my family again. A murmur rippled through the room. Shock, unease, a few nods. Ed rubbed his jaw, glancing at the others. You're serious, he muttered. Christ, James. Before anyone could respond, a sharp rap echoed from the door. James's assistant poked her head in, eyes wide. Sir, it's urgent. St. Luke's called. It's about your son. The word hung there, real and raw. James grabbed his coat, heart pounding. Meeting's over, he said, already moving. Victor called after him. Running again, Carver? But James didn't stop. The boardroom faded as he strode out, the elevator's ding a lifeline. The drive back to St. Luke's was a blur, city streets melting into gray. He burst through, the hospital doors finding Maggie in the chaos of the ER. Her face was pale, hands trembling as she gripped a clipboard. Thomas collapsed, she said, voice tight. Mid-surgery. His heart, it gave out. They're prepping him now. James froze, the world tilting. He's alive, she said, but barely. Needs the surgery yesterday. She looked at him, eyes searching. You said you'd fix this, can you? He nodded, throat dry. I'll pay for it, everything, whatever he needs. She shook her head. He won't take your money, James. Not if he knows it's you. Then don't tell him, he said, voice breaking. Not yet. Just, let me do this. Maggie hesitated, then nodded, a silent pact. She led him to the billing office where he wrote a check, anonymous, enough to cover the surgery and more. His hand shook, but he signed it, the ink a vow. Back in the waiting room, he sank into a chair, the antiseptic air heavy. Maggie sat beside him, her presence a quiet strength he didn't deserve. He'll hate me, James whispered, staring at the floor. Maybe, she said. But he'll live. That's what matters. He nodded, the boardroom's lights dimming in his mind. Victor had won the chair, maybe, but James had won something else. Control, not over others, but over himself. Dignity wasn't in the empire he'd lost. It was here, in this cracked room, choosing his son over pride, even if Thomas never knew. James. Carver sat in the dim light of St. Luke's recovery ward, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling the silence. Thomas lay in the bed before him, eyes closed, chest rising and falling beneath a thin hospital blanket. Tubes snaked from his arms, a lifeline James had paid for, anonymously, as Maggie had insisted. The surgery had been a success, the doctor said hours ago, but Thomas wasn't out of the woods. Not yet. James's hands rested on his knees, still in the suit he'd worn to the boardroom, now creased and stale. He hadn't left since writing. The check hadn't slipped. He couldn't. Maggie stood by the door, her arms crossed, watching him with a gaze that cut through years. You don't have to stay, she said, voice low but firm. He's stable. Go home. James shook his head, eyes fixed on Thomas. I'm not leaving. The words were simple, final, a vow he hadn't kept 40 years ago. He wouldn't break it now. She sighed, a sound heavy with decades of carrying what he'd refused. Suit yourself. She stepped closer, peering at Thomas, her face softening. He's tough. Always has been. Fought through fevers as a kid, never complained, just like his grandma. James's throat tightened. His mother flashed in his mind, her hands stitching late into the night, her voice soft but unyielding. Real men don't run. Thomas had her strength, Maggie's too, not his. He'd run from them all, built a tower of glass to hide the coward, beneath. Now sitting here, he felt small, smaller than the empire he'd lost. Maggie pulled a chair beside him, sitting with a quiet groan. He woke up once earlier, she said. Asked about the surgery. Who paid? I told him it was a donor. He didn't buy it, but he was too tired to argue. James nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Stubborn. Like you. She snorted. Like you too. Don't pretend he's all me. The truth of it settled between them, a fragile bridge. He glanced at Thomas, his son, a man of 38, who'd grown without him, who'd saved lives while James chased profits. The resemblance was there, faint but real. The jaw, the way his brow furrowed even in sleep. James reached out, hesitating, then brushed a damp cloth across Thomas's forehead, a small act clumsy but his. Maggie watched, silent, then spoke. I told him about you, before the surgery when he went under. Didn't want to, but he deserved to know if... She trailed off, swallowing. He didn't say much, just nodded. James's hand froze, the cloth trembling. He knows? Enough, she said. That you're here, that you're his father. Not the money part, he'd hate that. But he knows you came. The weight of it pressed down. Thomas knew and still slept, still silent. No anger, no forgiveness, just a nod. James set the cloth aside, hands folding in his lap. Will he see me? When he wakes? Maggie shrugged, weary. That's up to him. He's not one for handouts or heroes. You'll have to wait. Waiting. He could do that. He'd waited too long already. He leaned back, the chair creaking, and let the rhythm of the monitor steady him. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Maggie dozed in her seat. James stayed, eyes tracing Thomas's face, memorizing what he'd missed. The faint scar above his eyebrow, the lines of exhaustion etched deep. A life he hadn't shaped, but one he could still honor. His phone buzzed. Ed Thornton. He answered, voice hushed. What? You're out, Ed said, blunt. Vote's done. Victor's chair now. Stock stabilizing. But you're done. James exhaled, a slow release. Fine. Keep the company. I've got bigger things. Ed paused, thrown. You're not fighting? No, James said. I'm finished running. He hung up, the phone slipping into his pocket. The boardroom, the empire, it was gone, and he felt free, lighter than he'd been in decades. Thomas stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. James straightened, heart thudding. Maggie woke, leaning forward. His eyes fluttered open, hazel like hers, sharp despite the haze of painkillers. They landed on James, narrowing slightly. You, Thomas rasped, voice rough from intubation. The donor? James glanced at Maggie, who shook her head, a warning. No, he lied, voice steady. Just a visitor. Thomas studied him, skepticism flickering. Mom said you're my father. The word hung there, heavy and real. James nodded, hands clasped tight to keep them still. I am. James Carver. I didn't know, until now. I'm sorry. Thomas's jaw tightened, a storm brewing in his eyes. Sorry doesn't fix 40 years. I know, James said, meeting his gaze. I'm not asking it to. I just want you to live. That's all. Thomas looked away, staring at the ceiling, breaths shallow. I don't need you. Never did. The rejection stung, but James didn't flinch. You don't, he agreed. You're stronger than I ever was. But I'm here anyway. Maggie touched Thomas's arm, her voice soft. He's been here all night, Tom. Didn't budge. Thomas's eyes flicked back, searching James's face. He didn't speak, but the storm eased, just a fraction. Why now? He asked finally. James swallowed, the truth raw. Because I was wrong. I ran from you, from her, from everything that mattered. I built a life that's falling apart, and you're the one thing I can't let go of. Not again. Thomas said nothing, his gaze drifting to the monitor's steady beep. Silence stretched, thick with years unspoken. Then, faintly, he nodded. Okay. Stay if you want, but don't expect anything. I won't, James said, a vow as much to himself as to Thomas. Maggie squeezed Thomas's hand, a tear slipping free. James sat back, the chair a lifeline. He'd lost the company, the power, but gained this, a chance fragile and unearned. Later, he'd call his lawyer, redirect half his fortune to a fund for St. Luke's patients, Thomas's name on it, no strings. For now, he stayed, the beep of the monitor a rhythm of hope. Dignity wasn't in the chair he'd lost. It was here, beside this bed, in the quiet choice to be present, no matter the cost. James Carver stood in the soft glow of St. Luke's recovery ward, the late afternoon sun filtering through a narrow window above Thomas's bed. 2 weeks had passed, since the surgery, since he'd sat vigil through that first night, since he'd lost the chair at Carver Energy. Thomas slept less now, his strength returning in slow, stubborn increments. The tubes were gone, replaced by a single IV, and his color had shifted from ashen to a faint warmth. James hadn't left. Not for long. He'd go home to shower, change, then return, the plastic chair beside the bed his new throne. Maggie sat across from him, her hands folded around a chipped coffee mug, her silver hair catching the light. She'd softened these past days, her words less sharp, though her eyes still held a wariness he couldn't erase. "He's awake more today," she said, voice low. "Talked about going back to work. Stubborn fool." James smiled, faint but real. "Sounds familiar." She huffed, a half laugh, and sipped her coffee. The silence between them was easier now, not comfortable, but not hostile. A truce forged in shared waiting. He'd learned her rhythms, the way she hummed old hymns when she thought no one heard, the way she smoothed Thomas's blanket with a mother's care. He'd missed that once, missed her, and the regret was a quiet ache he carried without complaint. Thomas stirred, eyes fluttering open. They landed on James, steady and clear, no longer clouded by painkillers. "You again," he said, voice rough but stronger. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" "Here's where I need to be," James replied, leaning forward, hands clasped. No pleading, no pressure, just truth. Nowhere else. Thomas studied him, a long, searching look. "Mom says you've been here every day. Why?" James met his gaze, unflinching. "Because I wasn't there before. 40 years I chose wrong. Money, power, a life that didn't matter. I'm not choosing wrong again." Thomas's jaw tightened, a flicker of the storm James remembered from their first talk. "I don't need a savior. I've done fine without you." "I know," James said, voice steady. "You're better than I ever was. Stronger, braver. I'm not here to save you. I'm here to learn from you." The words hung there, raw and unguarded. Thomas blinked, caught off guard, then looked away, out the window where the sun dipped low. "Learn what?" he asked, quieter now. "How to be a man," James said. "Not the kind I was. Cold, running from everything. The kind you are, staying, fighting for what's right. I've got no right to ask for anything, Thomas. But I'm asking for time." Maggie's mug paused halfway to her lips, her eyes flicking between them. Thomas stayed silent, his breath even, then nodded, just once, barely perceptible. "Time," he said. "I can give you that. Nothing else yet." James exhaled, a weight lifting he hadn't known he carried. "That's enough." The room settled into a fragile peace, the monitor's beep a steady pulse. Maggie stood, brushing Thomas's hair back. "I'll get you some water," she said, leaving them alone, a rare trust. James shifted, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "I did something," he said, handing it to Thomas. "Not for you to owe me, just for you to know." Thomas took it, unfolding it with careful hands. A legal document. The Thomas Ellis Fund for St. Luke's patients, half of James's personal fortune, millions redirected to cover care for those who couldn't pay. No Carver name attached, no strings. Thomas's brow furrowed, then smoothed, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You didn't have to," he said, voice low. I did, James replied. Not for you to take me back, for them, for the people you fight for every day. I've got no company left, no boardroom. This is what I can do. Thomas folded the paper, setting it aside. Mom said you lost it all, the chair, the power. That true? True, James said. Victor's got it now. Stock's up, merger's back on. I walked away. Why? Thomas asked, sharper now, probing. James leaned back, the chair creaking. Because it wasn't worth keeping. Not if it meant losing this. Losing you, her, a chance to be more than a name on a building. I spent 40 years chasing shadows. I'm done. Thomas's gaze held his, weighing, judging. Then, slowly, he extended a hand. Not a hug, not forgiveness, but a start. James took it, his grip firm but gentle, feeling the calluses of a surgeon's life against his own softened palms. Okay, Thomas said. Time it is. Maggie returned, water in hand, and paused at the sight. She didn't speak, just set, the cup down and sat, a quiet witness. The sun sank lower, painting the room gold, and James felt a stillness he hadn't known in decades. Not peace, not yet, but a beginning. Days later, he moved out of his Houston penthouse, trading glass, walls for a modest house near St. Luke's, a place with a porch like Maggie's old one in Dallas. He took a role at the fund, not as a figurehead but a worker, sorting applications, meeting patients. No headlines followed. The scandal faded, Victor's triumph overshadowed by Carver Energy's rebound. James didn't care. He'd written, a letter to the board, left on Ed's desk. Dignity isn't what I keep, it's what I give. Take the company. I found something better. Now he sat with Maggie and Thomas in the hospital's small lounge, a tray of lukewarm coffee between them. Thomas, discharged that morning, wore jeans and a faded jacket, his strength returning. I'm not calling. You, Dad, he said, a half-smirk tugging his lips. Not yet. Fair, James said, matching the smirk. James works, Maggie chuckled, a sound like home. You two, she muttered, shaking her head. The window framed them, light spilling through, a glow beyond the glass he'd shattered long ago. He'd lost an empire, but gained this. A family, tentative and bruised but real. Honor wasn't in the wealth he'd amassed or the power he'd wielded. It was here, in the time he'd earned, the lives he'd touched, the man he was becoming. James sipped his coffee, bitter and warm, and let the moment hold him. And so, in the quiet glow beyond the window, a man who once ruled an empire found something greater, not in the wealth he'd lost, but in the family he'd reclaimed and the lives he'd touched. It's a reminder that true dignity isn't built on power, but on the courage to face our past and mend what's broken. If this journey moved you, if it made you think about what really matters, then please give it a like and hit that subscribe button. Join us for more stories that stir the heart, because every tale of redemption deserves to be heard.